The Dangerous Vegan, The Politics of Scholarship, Identity, and Consumption in the Anthropocene. I was sort of in this mood when I came up with that title because one of the things that I'm really interested in is the way that veganism is a threat to a lot of things in our society in particular, and the way that that threat gets conveyed. I'd also kind of gotten in a bit of a tiff with a couple of animal studies scholars who told me that I wasn't really doing a thing. And so I was like, I am doing a thing, it's this thing. So I was in kind of a space. So that's kind of where this all came from. So I'm gonna read this, and I'm gonna try and engage you as much as I can in a little bit of a discussion, because I am much more comfortable teaching, and I feel really weird standing over here in the corner, but I don't really have a choice. I would float around. I would put you in a circle if it was really up to me. So I've written about the concept of the dangerous vegan before. Back in 2015, when I looked at the post-9/11 US landscape through a vegan studies lens, which is the Vegan Studies project that I wrote. My specific focus at that time was the way that veganism was viewed with suspicion, as were many previously unsuspicious things, in the wake of September 11th. And the ways that a growing acceptance of ways of eating and being that were non-standard, and veganism and vegetarianism had kind of made this like move into the mainstream a little bit back in the 90s. At least that's what I learned when I was doing this research. These things suddenly became really suspicious after September 11th, which is odd but not really surprising. Everything that was sort of seen as non-standard American was viewed as potentially terrorist. So I had this quote that is in the Vegan Studies Project, actually. It's Anthony Bourdain, and he said this before 9/11, but I thought it was really telling that this was a thing that he wrote about in Kitchen Confidential, which was this really famous book that he wrote. And he said, vegetarians and their Hezbollah-like splinter faction, the vegans are a persistent irritant to any chef worth a damn. Vegetarians are the enemy of everything good and decent in the human spirit, and an affront to all I stand for, the pure enjoyment of food. So comparing vegans to Hezbollah, which is a terrorist organization. So I thought that was kind of an interesting one. And then the other one, this is a Village Voice article, again from the 2015 book. Village Voice article by Matt Snyders chronicled the FBI's solicitation of informants to monitor protest groups during the 2008 Republican National Convention in St. Paul, Minnesota. What they were doing was looking for an informant, someone to show up at vegan potlucks throughout the Twin Cities and rub shoulders with the Republican National Convention protesters, schmoozing his way into their inner circles, then reporting back to the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force, a partnership between multiple federal agencies and state and local law enforcement. So there was so much suspicion, even up into 2008, that vegans were this radical group of people that were dangerous, that they were being monitored. I love this cartoon, making connections between foreign and domestic enemies. We spied on vegans. Vegans eat hummus. Hummus is Middle Eastern. Al-Qaeda is Middle Eastern, therefore vegans are terrorists. So before I talk about the dangerous vegan in 2019, I want to mention what it means to do something called vegan studies at this moment in time in North Carolina at Western Carolina University, and what it means to talk about veganism within the field of animal studies kind of more broadly. I've never been big enough of a player in the academic field to get the wrong kind of attention from people in Raleigh, North Carolina, who might be scrutinizing the things that scholars talk about. But this is a real thing, and scholars who talk about things that are perceived as too liberal or too lefty or too whatever often get sort of singled out, or their programs get destroyed. I was just thinking, for example, about Jean Nickel, whose Center on Poverty, Work, and Opportunity ran afoul of the North Carolina Board of Governors some time back, and they got rid of his center, which was critical of North Carolina legislature's tendency to make poverty worse. So he got kind of knocked out because of things that he was saying. And also there's this thing called the Professor Watch List. I don't know if you guys have seen that. It kind of came about in 2016, right after Trump got elected. And it's sort of a list of academics who are doing things that are problematic to the people in charge of this list. And those can be anything from failing too many students to advocating for women's rights to criticizing capitalism. So it's a really fascinating thing. I don't know anybody on it, and I'm very happy not to be on it, because when scholars get put on this thing, then they get hounded, and it's really kind of, Yeah, crazy. With that in mind, I want to revisit what it means to be a dangerous vegan in 2019, both as a vegan and a vegan scholar, the danger to vegans in 2019, and the vegan threat that underscores much of the current discourse on the right and the left about politics, climate change, and what it means to be living at this particular moment in history, and what it means to produce vegan scholarship more generally. I wanted to look at a couple of questions that I got asked by an interviewer for an interview with this guy named John Junker, who is the founder of Ashland Creek Press. It's a press that writes, that publishes lots of eco-critical novels, lots of vegan literature, kind of talk to you a little bit about what it means. So there's several things kind of underscoring this talk. One is the idea of what it means to create a discipline. What is this thing? What are the politics of it? Where does it live? So he asked me, where does this field live within your university? It would seem that it would and should attract studies from a wide range of disciplines: English, sociology, gender studies, environmental studies. And my answer was that at my university, the field lives with me. So it's just me doing it. We don't have a gender studies program at Western Carolina. And I was just, and by the way, this is not a diss to Western Carolina. I love working at Western Carolina University. But there are limitations in terms of the structure of the place and what one can do there. We had a women's studies minor, and that went away, I think, back in like 2010 or 2008 or so. I have colleagues in English and in other departments who have taught some chapters from the book, but as of now, there isn't really a place outside of the English department where vegan studies lives. We have an environmental science program, but no environmental studies program and no animal studies program at Western Carolina. And I'm curious, I know that, what do you guys have here? What's the landscape like with regard to animal studies and gender and all that stuff? Anybody can tell? Yeah, Catherine. You do have, yes, I know that. I know you have an animal studies minor, which is great. So there are places where something like this could live outside of English at Appalachian, which is interdisciplinary and kind of interesting. I'll go to the next one. This was me in a bad mood. This is the thing that got me into the bad mood that started all of this. I got asked, you make it clear that vegan studies is uniquely different than animal studies. Can you explain? So I don't want to read this big long answer. But basically what I said, if I go kind of to the bottom of this, was that vegan studies is pretty clear in its assertion that consuming animals is not okay. And the work that vegan studies scholars are doing engages with how veganism shows up in various texts in ways that are often quite disruptive to the animal studies status quo. And part of what I was saying, for those of you familiar with animal studies, is that a lot of scholars in the field of animal studies write a lot about sustainable meat and ethically sourced meat, and veganism has never really fit in all that well. And so I think that was part of the reason for taking veganism outside of it. So this is the quote that got me yelled at by some animal studies people who told me that I should just read more animal studies, and I maybe didn't know what I was talking about. Okay, so now to come back out from that, I'm just going to give you guys some anecdotes. On the first day of my English 206 class, which is a liberal studies course on environmental literature, I always ask, what are your thoughts about the environment? The students in this class are not me. They were children during the 2008 financial crisis, and watching their parents go through the fallout has impacted many of them deeply. They don't remember 9/11, or they weren't even alive when it happened. They have, however, lived with the specter of mass school shootings looming large over them every day of their lives. The first student who answered my question this semester, a construction management major named Kevin, said, and I'm quoting, "It's fucked, we're fucked," about the environment. And so this to me was an interesting shift, because I'm really pretty used to my students being the optimists in the room. I'm the one who's more pessimistic. And so, this really kind of threw me when this is what he said. This semester, I'm noticing a shift in terms of the way that my students are reacting to environmental issues. And I don't know if that's because we're at this sort of precipice where things are just gonna have to change, where we've lost hope, or hopefully things are going to get better. I'm not sure. I sometimes gauge the difference between my undergraduate environmental lit students and my graduate students through an exercise that I'm going to call Margaret Atwood's taxonomy of doom, which I calculate based on their response to a question that I ask about a short story that she has written called Time Capsule Found on the Dead Planet. Okay, so I'm gonna make you guys read the story right now. It's really, really short. And by the way, how many of you guys know who Margaret Atwood is? She was just robbed of the Nobel Prize. Okay. Anyway, this is a short story that she wrote in 2009. In the first age, we created gods. We carved them out of wood. There was still such a thing as wood then. We forged them from shining metals and painted them on temple walls. They were gods of many kinds and goddesses as well. Sometimes they were cruel and drank our blood, but also they gave us rain and sunshine, favorable winds, good harvests, fertile animals, many children. 1 million birds flew over us then, 1 million fish swam in our seas. Our gods had horns on their heads, or moons, or steely fins, or the beaks of eagles. We called them all-knowing. We called them Shining One. We knew we were not orphans. We smelled the earth and rolled in it. Its juices ran down our chins. And by the way, she structures the story in ages, so there are 4 of them. This is the first one. In the second age, we created money. This money was also made of shining metals. It had 2 faces. On one side was a severed head, that of a king or some other noteworthy person. On the other face was something else, something that would give us comfort, a bird, a fish, a fur-bearing animal. This was all that remained of our former gods. The money was small in size, and each of us would carry some of it with him every day, as close to the skin as possible. We could not eat this money, wear it, or burn it for warmth, but as if by magic, it could be changed into such things. The money was mysterious, and we were in awe of it. If you had enough of it, it was said, you would be able to fly. In the third age, money became a god. It was all-powerful and out of control. It began to talk. It began to create on its own. It created feasts and famines, songs of joy, lamentations. It created greed and hunger, which were its 2 faces. Towers of glass rose at its name, were destroyed and rose again. It began to eat things. It ate whole forests, croplands, and the lives of children. It ate armies, ships, and cities. No one could stop it. To have it was a sign of grace. And lastly, in the fourth age, we created deserts. Our deserts were of several kinds, but they had one thing in common: nothing grew there. Some were made of cement, some were made of various poisons, some of baked earth. We made these deserts from the desire for more money and from despair at the lack of it. Wars, plagues, and famines visited us, but we did not stop in our industrious creation of deserts. At last, all wells were poisoned, all rivers ran with filth, all seas were dead. There was no land left to grow food. Some of our wise men turned to the contemplation of deserts. A stone in the sand in the setting sun could be very beautiful, they said. Deserts were tidy because there were no weeds in them, nothing that crawled. Stay in the desert long enough and you could apprehend the absolute. The number 0 was holy. You who have come here from some distant world to this dry lake shore and this cairn, to this cylinder of brass in which on the last day of our recorded days I place our final words, pray for us who once too thought we could fly. Okay, so the question that I always ask my classes is, what age are we in? So what do you guys think? No one's going to talk to me because it's scary.
Anthropocene.
Okay, yes, absolutely. Which one of the 4, that's a good point. Which one of the 4 is that? Yes.
What money is God?
Okay.
Was it 3 maybe?
That's 3. Okay, so you guys, so 3. Any other thoughts?
Between 3 and 4.
3 and 4. Anybody, like, we are definitely in the 4th. You think we're in the 4th? Okay, so the point I was going to make about this is that heretofore, and I've only taught this story for a few years, most of my undergrad students are like, we're in the 3rd. We're pretty squarely in the 3rd. My graduate students are a bit older, like, oh yeah, we're definitely in the 4th. So, my thinking is that it has something to do with age, where you think we are. But this semester, my undergrads also think that we are in the 4th. Let me get back to my paper. And that worries me, that, if we are there, then what do we do and how do we get out? I try to say something encouraging along the lines of there's still hope. There are things that we can do to change the future. I have my students do a footprint calculator and we discuss the ways of reducing our carbon footprint. Most of them discover that if everyone on the planet lived like they live, it would take 5 or 6 Earths to sustain us all. I don't know if you guys have ever done one of those. It's kind of terrifying to see that. I ask if they will make changes. Some nod, some say no, and some just shrug. So this semester I asked one of them, Sarah, one of the no's, why not? And she said, and this is another, I'm paraphrasing, Why should we? Your generation ruined everything, and you expect us to fix it. It's too late. So this was also one of those moments where I was like, okay, this is a shift. I'm noticing this shift. An older student, she's about 30, but one of my undergrads, who is a vegan, said to me, we can do plenty of things on our own. We can go vegan, we can fly less, we can recycle, but without institutional large-scale change, then who cares? What good is it going to do? This is a very pessimistic talk, isn't it? I'm very sorry. I promise that it gets better. Okay, so I want to move on to kind of so I'm processing all of this semester, and I'm trying to make sense of it. And the other thing was, on a 90-degree day last week, it was 90 degrees last week in Coetzee, completely unprompted, one of my world literature students said to me, and this was apropos of nothing, she goes, I hope I die before the planet does. And I just was like, wow, this is really intense. It's too hot, and there are too many of us, which is something that a good friend of mine said. And immediately after telling me that, she told me this story about how her 6-year-old son's class was working on a project about the environment that asked what they could do to help the earth. This is her 6-year-old kid. Her son is not vegan, not vegetarian, and neither is she. She's just a friend of mine. Her son said, go vegan. And the teacher told him that that was too political of a position, and he needed to come up with something else. So I was just going to give you guys this slide about actually how good it is for the environment to be vegan. There's a lot of evidence about that. 6 to 10% in food-related greenhouse gas emissions. You can kind of read these statistics about what would change if everybody went vegan or transitioned to vegan. So veganism is too political. It's a position, not a solution. It's a threat. And I want to talk about that. So my first sort of realization that veganism was a threat was that I had a vegan sticker on the back of my car. And these two guys in a pickup with a gun rack loaded with guns cut me off at a gas station to start telling me that I should eat meat. So that really happened to me. It was a couple of years ago, and it terrified me. The sticker's gone. I got rid of it. And that really upset me because I really liked having the vegan sticker on my car. But it let me know that in some ways this identity is an unsafe identity. And I realize there are lots of reasons for that. And there are lots of reasons that make a lot of sense for why people feel threatened by this. So, okay, let me just kind of get back to this. Individual change without an institutional mandate for a cultural shift is probably not going to do a lot of good. And talking about changing our culture, changing the culture of the entire planet is terrifying, and it can get you in trouble. People get upset about it. It can be dangerous. I can be vegan, but if I'm the only person in the room or in my classroom, what calculus allows that action to actually make a difference? And I have no idea what the answer to that question is. And maybe it doesn't make a difference. Okay, here's where things get more positive, I promise. Okay, veganism certainly is having a moment, though, in terms of the way that it is showing up in the mainstream press. And it is perhaps threatening the status quo in ways that might change things, although I'm not entirely sure. For example, you can dress up like a sexy Beyond Burger for Halloween. Okay? I have no idea why someone would want to do this, but you can. You can also, if you want, dress up like a sexy handmaid from The Handmaid's Tale, or a sexy Mr. Rogers. So this is the place where we are in our culture. Okay, so why you would want to do this is beyond me. Here are a few truths about what's happening. In 2019, veganism is disruptive. It's part of the so-called resistance, and this is really true. I'm not going to read this whole quote, but there's this article called The Vegan Resistance that was looking at what's happening with vegans, and the author, Susan Ziegler, says, I'll read that bottom quote, however, the third possibility may be emerging. Veganism could be a motivating force for left-wing populism, a populist movement that is vegan, that changes the way that we think about things, inspiring social change. And also, in the UK, things are very different. This actually gives me hope. I was going to give you the statistic. The UK vegan population will skyrocket 327% by 2020. That's huge. I was on the phone actually with a friend of mine in the UK who is doing some work in this area, and she goes, are you getting kind of tired of how normal veganism is? And I was like, I'm not in the UK. It's not normal here at all. But it is getting, more traction in other places. And I also, this sort of fascinating Disney World is committing to having a lot of vegan options as well. And that is a really interesting thing. When a business as large as Walt Disney starts buying into companies that are vegan-based, that changes capitalism. And so that to me is really, really interesting. So I want to talk just a little bit about Dennis Kucinich. I want to talk about politics, and I promise that I'm not going to go on and on forever. This paper is only 6 pages long, but I'm just going to keep sort of adding to it. I don't know if anybody knows who Dennis Kucinich is. He was a guy who ran for president back in 2000. So many of you probably don't remember him or weren't alive for that. He was vegan, and he was like completely mocked as a result of this, as were the rest of his progressive platform ideas. So he was mocked and misunderstood. Kucinich has even said that people didn't even know what the word vegan meant at that time, thinking it was something akin to membership in a religious cult. Which maybe it is, I don't know. Last year, however, the Washington Post heralded him as ahead of his time, the future of progressive politics. So that's Dennis Kucinich, he's this little man. Democratic candidates for the 2020 presidential nomination are running on platforms that address all the stuff that Dennis Kucinich was doing back in 2000. They're talking about climate change, they're championing animal welfare, generally all things that he was interested in. Bernie Sanders has spoken out against factory farming. Even Marianne Williamson has made food insecurity and the dangers of the standard American diet a talking point in her campaign. Cory Booker is vegan, even as he has kind of shied away from embracing that sort of on a larger stage. But there's also a lot of, I pulled up this, why I will vote hell no on a vegan president. That's clearly causing people to have some thoughts. Mississippi just backed down from trying to ban the word burger from plant-based burgers after a challenge in court. So the meat industry is afraid of plant-based meat, and they want to get rid of the word burger. So they backed down on that. The dairy industry is doing its best, both here and abroad, to ban the word milk from being used to denote plant-based milk alternatives. All of this agitation is clear evidence that veganism poses a threat, at least to capitalism that thrives on animal exploitation. So if we change the dynamic of what is in demand, then things might actually change. Check out the language of threat that characterizes much current media about veganism. Vegan threat to dairy should be taken seriously. Is mainstreaming of veganism a threat to your brand? And this is for fast food restaurants. This was an article about fast food restaurants. So another thing that I read is this article in Cosmos that I'll pull up, that says that vegetarianism actually threatens animals because, which is so weird, right? But the idea is that there are people, I'm gonna read this sort of last or second to the last little bullet point here. The majority of omnivorous humans regard vegetarians and vegans as perfectly normal, although I'm not entirely sure I believe that. A degree of hostility towards them does exist in some quarters. A 2015 US study found that some survey respondents evaluated plant eaters, quote, more negatively than several common prejudice target groups, including African Americans. So there's this idea that if you don't like vegans, you're gonna go out and eat some more cow just to get even with us for that. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. Okay, and there's Trump. So what's at stake? See what I did there? Pretty funny, is a reconsideration within the free market to what specific wars consumers are willing to wage in the marketplace and also the people selling products. Fast food restaurants suddenly all offer the Impossible Burger, seemingly, even as they continue to serve meat. Because of its massive demands, Walt Disney has strained Just, I don't know if you guys know Just Foods. They make an egg, which I'm sort of in love with, which is so weird. It's like a vegan egg. So suddenly you can't find Just products anywhere because Disney is now buying all of them and selling them. So there's this, which is really making me angry because they also make the best vegan ranch dressing and I can't get it anywhere in town. In my environmental literature class, we just finished reading a novel called Trampoline. It's a novel, it's an illustrated novel. I don't know if anybody, do you know Trampoline? About a 15-year-old accidental environmental activist named Dawn Jewell. Yeah, she's fighting against mountaintop removal in this sort of fictional place in Kentucky where she lives. We talked a lot, this is sort of my ending, so you guys are gonna have to come back in and talk to me about what you think about this. We talked a lot about the strange liminal power of teenage girls, which is something that I'm very interested in. Their ability to be dangerous and inspire change and the precarious nature of that power. And I'm sort of thinking of Joan of Arc, for example, at 19, who led this movement and then was killed. So the next thing that I had wanted to write, if I can pull myself away from vegan studies, is something I imagine might move me away from this field a little bit, because I've been steeped in it for a long time. I'm wanting to write what's called a braided narrative, which is part fiction, part nonfiction, nothing like I've ever done before, and part of which will be about the influence of Astrid Lindgren's character of Pippi Longstocking. I don't know if you guys know her. She was my favorite childhood, just complete badass who does everything that she's not supposed to do and is super strong. But then there emerges Greta Thunberg, and I'm drawn right back in again. Oh, I'm sorry, I was going to pull this up about, I left this part out. This is all these people talking about the Green New Deal and how it's going to take away all your cows and hamburgers. Right, let me pull it. So there's Greta Thunberg. I'm drawn right back in again to the danger, to the challenge, and the work for which we all should be responsible as we feel our way through this era in time. I found this article where she's actually getting compared to Pippi Longstocking, so everything just kind of comes back around full circle. Thank you. One thing that I have always found, for me, veganism was always about the animals. I didn't really care about my health or pretty much anything else. I'm terrible. I was the worst vegan. Jason, my husband, who is a chef, referred to me as a meat avoider. He's like, you're the worst vegetarian I've ever known. You're just a meat avoider. And you would just eat carbs and bread all the time. If it wasn't for him, he's probably right. So for me, it's always been about the animals. But that argument doesn't work if you're trying to convince people that they should change. The health argument does. I think that has a greater impact, and you kind of see it. I'm really curious to know what Bernie Sanders is going to do post-heart attack, because he's a really big meat eater, and he even, I have stuff, I gave a talk one time about a book that he wrote the introduction to that's about meat. It's called Good Meat. And I keep thinking, I wonder if he'll change. Bill Clinton, his health went downhill and he became vegan, and so the health argument seems to work, I think, in ways that the environmental one maybe doesn't. So I think that's a really good point.
Another thing is, I don't know if you saw it recently, but there was a talk where this lady stood up, I think it was in Australia or something, and she was like, eat the babies. Did you see that?
Yeah, I did.
And I think that was planted or something, but that kind of reminds me of what you're talking about.
Yeah, that was unfortunate.
Was that planted? I mean, that's kind of like the aggressive retaliation thing. I don't know.
I don't know. Was it, Kevin? I think so. Okay, yeah. Yeah. So there's things that I think can be really harmful. I was thinking that there was also a town hall where Kamala Harris was speaking, and somebody from Direct Action Everywhere got up on stage and took the mic away from her to talk about animal rights, and I was like, this is really not a good look. So I think there's ways that this guy gets on the stage and takes the mic away from the woman of color who's speaking and starts talking about animal rights, and I just was like, oh no, this is not okay. So yeah, sorry, I don't know where I was going with that, but yeah. Okay, so I'm repeating this question, which is about how veganism potentially opens up sort of ways of a kind of left-wing populist resistance. So, well, to my mind, being vegan is not just about not eating animals. It's kind of, it's about making all sorts of decisions that are contrary to the things that our society is sort of consistently telling us we have to do, in terms of what we wear, in terms of what kind of entertainment we partake in terms of what we eat. And so to me, it's like if you're thinking about that, like that your consciousness is sort of always reading the situation through that kind of lens of how much am I involved in pushing back against these things, then that seems to me like you're sort of always resisting anyway. The problem with vegans, and there is a lot of research about this out there as well, is that we're very bad at network building, and because we tend to be sort of loners. I mean, that's statistically this is true. We don't tend to be joiners of groups, and so the idea of there being a vegan movement is really kind of an oxymoron, because vegans don't really do that. I don't know if that will always be the case or not. So again, I think it's, this sort of groundswell is maybe coming about, and people are kind of getting to this place on their own, and there's enough of us that it feels like populism in a way. Sure, and I think, part of that too is that you're actually your existence is a political statement in a lot of ways, because, you know, the minute that you are the person at the table who isn't eating what everybody else is eating, then you're actually requiring everybody else at the table to take stock of their own choices, which is I'm glad of that in some ways, but it's also just incredibly awful when it happens. And I got called, I remember one time getting called like a totally normal vegan. Like I was out to dinner with these people that I didn't know very well, and they're like, wow, you're normal and not at all judgmental. And I was like, okay, you know, it's not judgment. It's actually, I have all this insecurity about, you know, the reaction I'm going to provoke in you just by existing. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about it, is that, you know, my existence is a political act. Every choice that I make is a political act. But yeah, how it translates into something bigger and broader and more cohesive. Yeah, and if we've got a vegan, you know, candidate for president who doesn't really want to talk about his veganism, then what does that mean, you know? If you're passionate about something that it can be perceived as aggressive, like Donald Trump and his passion about not having immigrants in the United States. And I think that if you are passionate about something that isn't popular, like veganism, then that can really turn people off. And I think that's part of why, you know, somebody asked Cory Booker, do you think everybody should eat the way you do? And he paused for a minute and he said no. And I think that that was a defense mechanism. Like if he said yes, then he would have just been destroyed. Like there would have been no chance for him to go anywhere. So yeah, that's a really good point. Passion can feel like an attack sometimes. Question about what our role is as academics in terms of critiquing as opposed to simply providing neutral data, I guess, about things. And I'm not sure I think that the STEM fields are neutral either, but that's for a different conversation. But yeah, I think, and I recognize that I feel like that's what we have to do. And I think also in the humanities, I mean, you're in philosophy and I'm in English, and that's what the humanities are about, is sort of looking at the history, looking at the politics, looking at the thinking through the lens of making judgment calls about it. And I also feel like the longer I do this as a career, the more outspoken I am, and maybe that's because I feel safer with tenure and maybe nobody's gonna fire me or whatever, but I did speak out very strongly against Western Carolina taking money from the Charles Koch Foundation, and that got me in the press in a lot of ways that were kind of terrifying when it happened. But I think that's what you have to do. I just think that's part of you have the security to do it. And I also feel like that, you know, I always welcome students to push back against what I'm saying, and I feel like I am incredibly respectful of their opinions because they are living in this world in ways that I'm not and I never will. Thank you. Thank you so much.